This is Predictive Services meteorologist Chuck Maxwell with the 2013 Fire Season Considerations and Outlook for the Southwest, issued by SWIC Predictive Services on March 6, 2013. As always, we'll be taking a look at our main seasonal fire potential factors, and those are drought, fine fuels condition, seasonal temperature and precipitation, spring and early summer weather patterns, and the nature of the summer monsoon. Starting with drought conditions, we're looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor across the top left-hand portion of the screen and the seasonal drought outlook across the lower left-hand portion. The bottom line is we're looking at severe or worse long-term drought ongoing across almost the entire region. We have some areas of lesser severity, especially across southwest and portions of western Texas and along the Mogollon Rim in Arizona. However, the drought outlook calls for drought to persist or worsen across the entire region through the springtime. At this point, long-term drought impacts are basically a given in our outlook methodology. The best we can hope for is temporary mitigation of drought impacts with any wetter periods we might see, and the big picture impact is increased volatility and severity during fire season. Taking a look at the fine fuels contribution, well, overall drought conditions mean a general lack of excessive continuous fine fuels across the area. With that said, the wetter monsoon we had over the summer of 2012 west of the Continental Divide and also across portions of southwestern Texas has led to a more normal or better carryover fine fuel condition there. Better winter moisture west of the Divide and also across portions of the Texas Panhandle have brought both some compaction of fine fuels due to the snowfall, but also a better potential for a spring growing season when the temperatures warm up in the coming weeks and months. Below average fine fuel loading overall is present and expected to continue, however, for much of western Texas and much of the state of New Mexico except for far west central portions. And we expect the fine fuels factor to be highly dynamic this spring, with alternating periods of moisture and warmth, perhaps promoting some green up here and there, curing during drier periods. Basically, this picture is going to change perhaps on a weekly or certainly monthly basis as we move through the spring. Taking a look at the wintertime temperature and precipitation anomalies, we have temperature anomalies in the upper left, precipitation as a percent of average in the lower left, and the snowpack as a percent of average in the bottom right. Well, the big picture for us is it was cold and dry overall, with areas of above normal precipitation limited to parts of Arizona and western Texas, where you see the blues and greens down in the picture in the lower left. At the same time, much of New Mexico remained very dry with considerably below normal precipitation. The main impacts from this winter season has been some fine fuels compaction from snowfall and an enhanced chance for a spring growing season in the more moist areas, especially across the western portion of the region and potentially across the far east as well. As a result of the conditions through this winter, snowpack as of early March was generally only 50 to 80% of average, so below to much below normal when snowpack should be quite high this time of year. One more fact I wanted to point out with regard to temperatures, this was one of the colder overall winters in about 10 or 15 years across the Southwest. Taking a look at the temperature and precipitation outlook for the springtime period, March through May, well, we're looking for an overall west coast trough pattern, but with very high variability, in part due to a lack of any driving climatic forcing. We're not seeing a predominant La Nina or El Nino this year, which can usually help us to really hone in on the predictions for the coming months. So what we're looking at is more of a pattern-driven approach, with the trough on the west coast being the most likely scenario going forward. What this means for us is we'll still be dry on average across the Southwest, with a tendency for cooler temperatures across the west and warmer temperatures across the east, but we're going to see significant variability in storm-to-storm impacts as we see systems move through the southwest this spring. Pattern variances could bring significant moisture into both northwest and eastern portions of the area, with sustained dryness most likely in between, similar to what we've seen this winter. So looking at the precipitation anomaly forecast down here, overall dry, but we're expecting to see some bouts of moisture into Arizona and also probably some up into southwest and west Texas as well, which would somewhat modify this outcome. The big picture pattern looks to be fairly consistent, meaning potentially a more highly variable than typical springtime period. Looking more at the spring and early summer weather pattern, here at the potential mean jet stream, We're looking at split flow jet stream suggested with this mean western trough, with storm systems tending to pass either north of the region across the four corners, or potentially slowing and dropping southward towards the Baja within this mean pattern. This is a mean overall picture, kind of like the precipitation anomalies I showed you earlier. This will be the average for the 3 months, but there'll be substantial variability within this, which will be very important going forward. If this pattern persists in this fashion, typical windy dry periods will occur, but periods of more moist and cool conditions might even be more likely across both the northwest and eastern and southeastern portions of the region. Still, the average overall will be dry. Looking more at the variances we were discussing there, continued higher variability and lower confidence pattern based on the variance of this west coast trough pattern in the absence of any larger driving forces we can key off of. The two most likely solutions we're expecting to see in terms of storm-to-storm tracks and impacts, we have both a northern track and a southern track. The northern track is depicted down here on the left, and that would be with systems tending to skirt across the central Rocky Mountains north of the Four Corners. This would tend to bring windier and drier conditions to southern and eastern portions of the southwest region, with moisture impacts constrained more to the northern mountain areas. At the same time, our southern track provides almost an opposing impact, with systems really digging into the south. That would tend to bring substantial moisture to portions of Arizona, and also draw moisture up into portions of western Texas. However, New Mexico would remain fairly breezy and dry under this scenario, as well as the northern track scenario. So kind of interesting to see how there's some pretty substantial differences between these two in terms of impacts. At the same time, dryness does seem to be focused over New Mexico within both of these, so something to think about moving forward. Considering the monsoon for the upcoming fire season, very low confidence this far in advance, and considering the lack of any kind of forcing this year, some generalities regarding the monsoon are pretty much all we can offer, and that is basically that the hotter the spring is and the earlier winds diminish, the earlier and potentially more robust the monsoon tends to be. If we have a cooler, more active, and potentially wet spring, that tends to delay or diminish the monsoon. So really this highly variable spring pattern, how it plays out through April, May, will really have a huge impact on the monsoon, and right now we just don't know how it's going to work out. So for this year, the sooner we lose the influence of those southern track systems in the spring especially, the earlier, better the potential monsoon outcome could be. And just a note here, much of the eastern half of this area has seen 2 straight poor, dry monsoon seasons, so very dry summers the past 2 years across much of New Mexico and western Texas. In terms of trying to summarize the overall factors here textually, in terms of drought, severe and ongoing, with increased volatility overall, generally decreased potential in the fine fuel regimes because there's no moisture to drive grass growth, but increased volatility and potential in the heavier fuels complexes. For the fine fuels condition, we're looking for normal or better fine fuels contribution west of the Continental Divide, and maybe eventually portions of western Texas, depending how that plays out, with some areas of fine fuels compaction in the mountains and in the Texas Panhandle. We're looking for a below normal fine fuels contribution elsewhere, with a real lack of fine fuels across the entire eastern half of the region. In terms of seasonal temperature and precipitation, this La Nada influence trend for overall dry conditions will continue, with mixed fluctuating temperature signal being predominant through the spring as well as it was through the winter. Greater variability and uncertainty will predominate through the spring, with some moisture possible into the northwest and southeast portions of the region. In terms of the specific spring and early summer weather pattern, this mean western trough with varying northern and southern stream storm tracks offering opposing impacts will be a challenge. We're looking for the potential for a few game-changing wet spring storms are likely to occur that will bring a strong green up to some areas and some additional fine fuels growth. Where exactly that will occur, we do not know, but right now it favors the western half of the area. The focus for combined dryness and wind potential with this spring weather pattern will remain over New Mexico and into portions of southern Arizona. For the monsoon, really no good signal right now, with high spring variability leading to low monsoon predictability. Now we're going to look here graphically at the combination of fire potential factors to see how they overlay and potentially align or don't align. So starting with looking at drought, pretty much what I showed you earlier, drought predominant across much of the region. Probably the lightest impacts at this point are across southwestern Texas. If I throw on the layer for the fine fuels contribution, fine fuels are more abundant and consistent across the western portion of the region, There's some real question marks over here in portions of southwest and west Texas. We've had some moisture here, and there is potential for some spring growth. We're just not really sure how it's going to work out, and current surveys out there show the fine fuels as almost non-existent. Looking at where seasonal temperature and precipitation anomalies will be aiding above normal fire potential, mainly across the central and eastern portions of the region. It's been fairly cool across the west and a little bit more moist, and we've had some recent moisture across the far east, but where it's been consistently dry, if not warm, has been basically from portions of southeast Arizona across much of New Mexico and over into portions of west Texas. If we also add the layer for the contribution of spring and early summer weather patterns, this area in blue here indicates the region where we're expecting to see pretty consistently breezy to windy, warmer and drier conditions overall. Doesn't mean we won't see a little bit of moisture in here and certainly some changeability. We expect the cooler, more moist impacts, at least temporarily, to be out across the west, and also some moisture potential across the east. So really, spring and early summer weather patterns favoring this region for above normal significant fire potential. And we did not even throw the monsoon layer on this time, since we really have no signal for that. So we're really looking at the first four factors: drought, fine fuels conditions, seasonal temperature and precipitation, and the spring and early summer weather patterns. Just to highlight that the factors shown here are those which would support above normal fire potential. And one thing we're noticing right away compared to the past couple years is that we're looking at a more complex and dynamic alignment of factors than we've seen, making the outlook that much more complicated. Something new we're trying this season is actually looking numerically at the number of factors aligning to support above normal seasonal fire potential. So what we've done here, we didn't look at the monsoon as we said, we looked at the first four factors here. So what this image shows basically is how many out of those four factors are coming into play that would support above normal significant fire potential. I want to point out that the green shaded boxes are also areas where these areas are dominated by fine fuels here. We're weighting all the factors equally in this process, so really with the absence of fine fuels would knock this area out of contention right away, so the numbers are not quite as meaningful there unless we grow a bunch more grass. So the bottom line here is you can see how things are playing out. You see lower numbers across the east and then also across the far north and west, and you see higher numbers appearing across the southeast quadrant of Arizona and up across the mountainous regions of New Mexico. And you'll see how this comes strongly into play in driving the areas we've chosen for above normal significant fire potential for the season. So look at this map again and see where the numbers are, the higher numbers in this vicinity, lower numbers elsewhere based on alignment of the seasonal factors. And then when you take a look at the actual map we produced down here first, you see how closely that aligns. And that is exactly the process we're using, and that's why we're doing it this way. And sometimes why it's very complicated to explain in one picture how it got to be this way, because there's so many different things coming at you from different directions. So what we're looking at in general for March and April is generally normal fire potential due to high variability of conditions and spring weather pattern impacts, with coolness and moisture more prevalent near and west of the divide and a lack of fine fuels mitigating conditions further east. Green-up is also expected, particularly west of the continental divide. As we move into May and June, which is what this above normal area applies to, we're looking for above normal fire potential in and near mountain areas of New Mexico and across the entire southeast quadrant of Arizona. This will be driven mainly by drought impacts on heavier fuels, the availability of fine fuels, especially across the southeast quadrant of Arizona, and the maximum potential for warmth, wind, and dryness in this region. In terms of looking forward to the monsoon period into July, no clear signal yet. If we do see above normal significant fire potential increase as we go forward in the fire season, we expect it to be across the mountainous areas of Arizona. So we'll have to watch that as we go forward. This red may begin to spread north and west with the next outlook. Our deciding factors overall for this outlook are variability in the spring weather patterns and moisture impacts, including fine fuels growth, and the timing of the transition to the hotter, drier summer conditions that would trigger the contribution of drought impacts on heavier fuels area-wide. So really the drought conditions we have in a lot of the forests of Arizona may not be triggered until we get warmer and drier later in the year, but they may come on very quickly. That concludes this update to the seasonal fire potential outlook and considerations. Please contact myself, Chuck Maxwell, or my compatriot Richard Naden. Thank you for viewing. We expect to issue our next update during the first week of April.